Hello, hello. And here we are. I hope you're doing great. We're going to start B2C step by step. Bring your product to people. And we are with Matthias. Matthias, how do you feel?
Great, great.
Cool. Okay, you can talk to us in the chat. Yes, you see, so you have a chat with 3 different buttons, but if you are in the sessions chat, we will be able to read your questions. So feel free to ask all of your questions. I'll be going through them during the speech of Matthias that will last first 20 minutes. That will take the time to answer your question, and we'll go back to the next 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Are you happy? If you say yes in the chat, I will be too. And it will give us some energy to keep on giving you the best. Yeah, cool. I'm happy. I see a lot of women, actually. You make me feel good. Yes, because sometimes, it's depressing to be only. The problem is the only surrounded by men. Otherwise, it's cool to have both men and women. Yay! All right. Well, I leave you in good hands, and I'll be back in 20 minutes. Good luck, Matthias. See you.
Thanks, Alice. And thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm really excited to do this session on consumer go-to-market strategies. So some of what we'll be discussing will sort of echo what Usama was talking about, at least in the sort of theory of it. Hopefully, I'll be able to give you a bit more texture applied to the consumer context. So a lot of what, the tips that he was discussing, like doing things that don't scale, or not taking your launch too seriously, not, wasting time on PR, etc., are things that are definitely still true in the consumer context. Though I'll probably add some caveats as we go throughout this discussion. So you might hear some things that you just heard in the previous conversation. But hopefully you'll also hear a lot of new things, and we'll be able to address quite a lot of the questions that you might have in 15 minutes or so. So the way we're structuring this is that the first one is around the launch. And I mean, as you'll see, we won't just talk about launching. And then the second bit will be about choosing your first path or lane or whatever, but essentially your first acquisition channel. And we'll sort of go through what different acquisition channels you might be considering based on what kind of business you're building. So the first thing you should have in mind when you're thinking about your launch is that the launch is worthy of being celebrated for a simple reason, which is that celebration is a scarce resource in the adventure of building a startup or in the journey of building a startup. And so you shouldn't sort of waste an opportunity to celebrate something, but it's always better to celebrate things that are aligned with what you're trying to achieve, right? And so, launching is a pretty random thing to celebrate just because it's not exactly a milestone. It's a milestone in the sense that, your users are starting to use your product, but it doesn't really mean that you've understood what you're looking to understand yet. And I think that the reason that there's this whole sort of fantasy around the value of launching is that founders sometimes conflate 2 different kinds of launches. One launch is the product launch. So that's when a user first does something with your product. So it can be the first time that somebody buys something off your Shopify store, or it can be the first client that signs up to your SaaS product. Whatever that may be, that is definitely worth celebrating, right? Because it means you've done something, right? You've built something or produced something that people want. The thing that's more often thought about as the launch is sort of marketing PR launch, and I think Usama talked about that enough that I don't really need to go back into it. Another thing that we'll be talking about right after is intrinsic or network value, but really this doesn't matter, regardless of whether the product has value intrinsically or through the network that you're creating. It's very rare that the launch has value. And if you think about it, none of the most successful companies that had launches that were super memorable. Like if I asked you, oh, what did you think about Uber or Airbnb or Supreme, if you're into streetwear, if I asked you about their launches, like you wouldn't be able to remember because they weren't memorable events at all. And actually, even if I just asked you, what's the latest launch that you can think of, it'll probably take you some time to think, like to actually remember one. And if you think about the ones that you do remember, there are two kinds. There are the launches of products that were built by friends or ex-colleagues or whatever, so your close network. And so it's people who are trying to get some form of validation, so they're very happy to inform their past colleagues or their friends or their family, whatever, what they're doing, and that's cool. And that often is one of the actual values of the launch, is making people feel good about what they're doing. And then the other kind of launch that you'll remember is the launch of a product that was addressing a niche that you're a part of. So if you're really into, I don't know, if you're really into gaming, you probably, or like multiplayer games, or no, actually like RPGs. If you're really into RPGs, then you've definitely heard about Cyberpunk's launch, right? Because you like games. And so those are like the two kinds of launches that people end up remembering. The first kind shows you why people announce launches, which is essentially just to inform their friends and family. And the second kind shows you what a launch should be, which is something that's relevant to a small niche. So before we get to that bit, one important demarcation when it comes to launch strategy when you're building a consumer product is understanding in which bucket you fall. If you think about consumer products, at least in the sort of startup space, you can split them, and you can split them in loads of different ways. But one of the ways in which you can split them is in products that have intrinsic value versus products that have network value. So, and obviously, whether they have intrinsic or network value will be one of the key factors in determining what the best launch strategy is. So a product that has network value, I mean, there are loads of products that have network value. So for instance, if you're thinking about a social network, the value of the network only comes from you having other friends on it, right? If you're thinking about a dating app, the value of the app comes from you having potential partners in it. And so if you're launching a product that has network value, what matters in your launch is that you have a lot of hyper-local density, right? And so what I mean by density here, or rather local density here, isn't necessarily geographic density, though that might be relevant. So if you're launching a marketplace, for instance, so a marketplace is typically a thing that has network value, right? If you want to order a car to go from your house to the airport, what matters is that you have drivers that are near your house that can drive you to the airport. And so in that case, what you want is hyper-local density. It's the same thing if you're building a dating app, right? In most cases, at least in the pre-COVID world, a lot of people wanted to meet potential partners that lived near them. And so what you wanted to create wasn't to have loads of people spread around the globe, but you wanted to have people that were nearby in small hubs, which is why dating apps often started in college campuses, right? It's because it's a lot easier to get that form of density on a group of people that share this common characteristic and that are that are in a place that's easily addressable. I think a really good example of this when you're thinking about network value is TBH, so To Be Honest, which was an app that was bought, I think, 2 years ago now by Facebook. And they had a very interesting way to test their products and do these soft launches. They have this great memo. I can send it to the people who are interested by email if you like. But essentially what they would do is that they would identify high schools. So their product was focused on high school students. And so what they would do is that they would identify high schools, individual high schools. And they noticed that often teenagers would write which high school they would go to in their Instagram bio. And so they would go on the Instagram page of the place of the high school. They would go through the pictures and then look at, well, sort of scrape the pictures, look at the bios of the people who posted those pictures. And if there was the name of the high school, they would invite them to a private Instagram page, which was called TBH for High School ABC. They would keep that page private, so they would follow them so that the students would then request to follow back. And then they would wait like maybe a week. They would follow people for a week. Then they would wait until 4 p.m. on a given day. And then at 4 p.m. on a given day, they would switch the accounts to private, to public. And then all of a sudden, all these teenagers in the same high school would receive a notification saying, you're now able to follow, or what's it called? TBH just accepted your follow request. And in TBH's private Instagram follow request for that high school, they would have the TBH app. And so that allowed them to create density within the school in a way that was scalable. And they weren't doing it, just to increase the spread of their product, but they were doing it in a way to test different versions of their product. And so, sometimes there is no value in an app, and this is very often true in the case of consumer apps, if you don't have the sufficient network. And so finding what kind of launch you need will depend on whether or not you need this network in the first place. And so that brings me to another example. So this is, again, like we're focusing on the pre-product market fit stuff here for now. This brings me to another example, which has to do with an app or a tool that has intrinsic value. So where the value that you get from the app doesn't depend on anybody else using it. And so the example that I wanted to focus on, because I think it's particularly useful for consumer companies for intrinsic value, is Superhuman. So for those of you who don't know Superhuman, it's an email client that is supposedly helps you spend 50% less time on email. So it's for people who have a lot of email and who would like to spend less time treating email. They make that easier by automating some of the processes that you might do by hand, by having loads of shortcuts on the keyboard where you don't need to use the mouse, et cetera, and they gamified the application a lot. And actually, we'll be talking about it right after when we give examples of doing things that don't scale. But one of the things that I found most interesting, and again, I've linked to this article so that you guys can go and have a read afterwards. One of the things that I found most interesting is that Rahul Vohra, so the founder of Superhuman, gives gives an example of how they engineered, they built an engine to find product market fits. And so what he says is that, or sort of the metric that they use is, you have product market fit as a consumer app if 40% of your users would say they would be very dissatisfied if your product were to stop existing or stop operating. And so in order to find, in order to get to that point, you need to be spending a lot of time with your users, but you also need to be spending time understanding who your users really are. And what I found really insightful in the piece is that he says that when he sent the initial survey to all his users, I think he got something like 20% of his users who said they would be very dissatisfied if Superhuman were to disappear. But then when he started digging into the specific personas of who those users were, he discovered that actually within some of these subsegments, he had more than 40%, like 50% of the people who would be very dissatisfied if Superhuman were to disappear. And so because initially they were keeping they were keeping their products only in private beta, so people had to apply or sort of had to sign up in order to experience the product or to get to use the product. What he was able to do through that kind of launch was so he started off by bringing random people in, which were like people that he used to know and that he'd sent the initial invites. He put the product in their hands, got an idea of what those people, so like within those people who really liked the product, and then spent a lot of time speaking to those people. Also spent a lot of time talking to people who said that they would be somewhat dissatisfied, and that's essentially what guided their product, right? Is that they were spending time trying to understand who were the people who were hardcore fans and the people that they still needed to do a bit of convincing. And again, that kind of launch has a lot more value than sort of spending time in the press, right? Because if you get these initial hardcore fans, then you can find ways to bring more people like them. If, on the other hand, you're just spending your time bring loads of people in some funnel, but once they go through the funnel, no one really cares about your product, you're wasting a lot of time and energy. And so last thing on the sort of pre-product market fit, on the pre-product market fit end, I think, it's doing things at no scale is a nice thing to say, but it's good to give a couple examples. And so I wanted to give a couple examples from our portfolio. So one of the examples that we have is a company called Fempo. They do underwear for women when they have their periods. So like there's several other companies doing that. But they knew from the very beginning that if they didn't want to just become some sort of drop shipper, it was very important to create a sense of community. And I don't think they spent almost any money on marketing. All of it has been through word of mouth. And one of the things that they did very well was that at the beginning, they would individually handwrite notes to everyone, thanking them for their purchase. And it does have a pretty magical feel when the founder of a company whose product you really enjoy also sends you a nice little handwritten note. Like obviously none of their competitors or like the Alibaba drop shippers could do anything that would resemble that kind of experience. And so it means that, still a few years later, they're able to have this pricing premium. Another example that works quite well early on was Monzo. In the early days would have this golden ticket. So when you would receive your card in an envelope, a random amount of people would also get a golden ticket, and that golden ticket could be given to a friend for them to skip the queue. And so when you had that golden ticket, you felt like you're in charge of the chocolate factory. And so a lot of people would be sharing those things on Instagram. It's probably not something you can do when you're sending hundreds of thousands of cards out a week, but in the early days, it was definitely something that was feasible. And in the same way, I think one of the things that's very interesting, and we'll see if it's something that can scale or not. But I was talking about Superhuman right before when I was talking about launches for products with intrinsic value. And one of the things that's very interesting with Superhuman is that they're selling essentially a consumer software as a service. So like people call it luxury software as a service tool. But on top of that, you have an in-person onboarding when you're using the product. So whenever you're onboarded onto Superhuman, you spend 15 to 20 minutes with somebody from the Superhuman team that walks you through the product so that you get a sort of live tutorial. And they do a lot of things which are like meant to increase retention as well. So like they ask you to put Superhuman on the dock of your iPhone and remove the email app or the Gmail app. And then they teach you certain shortcuts. And so you can, at the very early stages, you can understand a lot more of what Superhuman has to offer. Plus, it feels very special. I mean, when I did my onboarding on the Superhuman, when I was onboarded onto Superhuman, they were having this like party or something. So the employee that was doing the onboarding tutorial had funny glasses and a wig or whatever. And it was a memorable moment. Like I sort of felt like I was part of their adventure. And, maybe they won't be able to do that when they have tens of thousands of signups every week. But in the meantime, they definitely can. And because they're trying to replace, something that people are, quite used to, it's really worth it to spend that time with the user. There's one thing, which is it creates a better experience for the user. But the second thing is that as a company, they learned a lot more. And I think that, having this culture early on in the company of like over delivering on the customer experience is really worth it. One, because how happy you're is probably one of the biggest predictors of your success. But two, because hopefully it sort of stays in the company's DNA. So I think we're right on time for questions before I move on to the next one.
Yes. Do you hear me now? Sorry, I was back a little bit. All right. So my friends, you can ask all of your questions right now. We can spend time on your context. Quentin is asking, if I launch a B2C travel startup, should I try to do business with affiliation link as every website, or sell the product directly to users? So
it's actually funny, we'll be talking about travel right after. But I think it's quite hard to answer that question because travel can mean a lot of different things. Like if you're, depending on what you're doing, you can't really afford to do business with affiliation links. It depends on how big your margins are. So if you're doing something that has very high margin, then sure, maybe you can do it with affiliation links. If you're doing something that's super or that's fairly low margin, you probably have to sell it directly to consumers. Typically, if you're selling packages and in the package you have to give money to the airline, some travel agent, booking, the hotel, blah, blah, you might not have all that much money left. And so if you're doing 15% margin and you have to give 10% in addition to the affiliate, that doesn't leave much money for you.
Cool. Question from Laudis. What's your feeling on funding B2C startups that won't make cash until they reach network effect these days in Europe?
So I think it's definitely one of the things that blocks big consumer companies from emerging in Europe. We actually haven't had that many breakout successes. I think one of the few examples that we have is Zenly, that was acquired by Snapchat. Now we have Yubo in Paris as well, which is sort of like a social network for kids kind of thing. But if you look at Yubo, they're actually making quite a lot of revenue. So they don't even really fit in that category. And if you look at Zenly, they didn't really have an easy trajectory. They had to raise money in conditions that weren't super easy in the early days. And they probably wouldn't have been able to fundraise in Europe. I think it was great that the acquisition deal with Snapchat was great because I don't think Europe at the time especially was fertile ground for that kind of company. Now I think it's becoming a bit easier, but not so much because the European landscape is getting better, but just because it's a lot easier for European founders to raise from investors abroad. And even very early on, especially when it's social. So like if you're in a market or if you're in a market that's global by nature, and often social networks are, it's a lot easier than it used to be to raise from American investors.
We have a bunch of early adopters. They currently don't pay, but are study participants. It's an healthcare app. Any suggestion for little pricing experiment to run with our waiting list while keeping the study participant model? The study participant model, we're collecting data for future efficiency studies. Efficacy studies, efficient studies, I think. Sorry. Efficacy, prove effectiveness.
Okay, so again, hard to give. The question is fairly specific, but I'm still not entirely sure what you guys are building, so it's not easy to give the most concrete answer. I'd say that honestly, one of the great things about being at the very, very beginning is that you can afford to do more or less any test. Is literally that you can afford to do more or less any test. So I wouldn't do no given test should put you in a position where if it fails, you die. But that being said, you can try anything. And one of the things that founders are often very reluctant to do is to make newcomers feel like they're getting less good of a deal than the initial customers. Because they have to pay, whereas the first ones got it for free, or because they have to pay more than the first ones did. But I really don't think that's a problem. Like that happens all the time. And it's completely okay. So what I would say is I don't exactly know the specifics of your industry, but if your experience is better, people should be able to pay, and they should be able to pay more than they pay elsewhere.
Elise is saying that's exactly how we feel. Thanks. All right. What do you think of B2B2C at the beginning to earn awareness versus putting all energy in direct channels to earn clients, being able to treat them with a lot of care and keep a bigger margin?
Yeah, so B2B2C is B2B2C is essentially a sort of a arrogant way to say partnerships. So it's like you go to a big company and
Maybe explain yourself. I get
yeah.
it's actually selling unique perfumes.
Okay, so like typically in the case of perfumes, it would be to go to like a retailer, so like Sephora in Europe, and ask Sephora to sell their perfumes, or to go to not necessarily a retailer, but it could be to go to a marketplace to sell the perfumes, or it could be to go to I don't know, like you could also do it with like events companies and put the perfumes in boxes for their customers. And the thing is, like these are great channels once you've reached a certain scale. But in the early days, I think there are a lot of things that make it a very poor choice. The first thing is that it's very rarely their priority. So like the events company has events to manage, the retailer has loads of other customers. So it'll take some time for customers to have your product in their hands. And because it's not their priority, usually they won't put that much effort into it, right? So the initial customers won't have the magical experience that you want them to have. And so you'll have no benefit from word of mouth, etc. The other thing is that you'll likely have to push so hard because it's not their priority. You'll have to push them so hard to get things done for that the comparable result, if you'd put all that intensity into selling directly to the customers, would probably be higher. You'll probably end up with more customers, plus you'll own the relationship. And then the last thing is, if you go to partners, so like typically, I mean, this is, if you're in beauty or in perfumes, the example of Sephora is always the same one, right? So it's like, it would make my life so much easier if my product is at Sephora. But the thing is that Sephora obviously knows that, right? So if they know that you're making 90% of your volume through them, then they have all the pricing power. Because if they say, imagine you sell it to them for 2 and then they sell it for 4 for their customers, well, they could just say, you know what, you used to sell it for 2, but you're making way too much money, so now you're just going to sell it for 1, right? And all of a sudden, your revenue's gone down, not 50, but essentially 45%. And your business doesn't look anywhere near as good. And because you were so dependent on Sephora, there's not much you can do, right? You're still happy to sell through them. So it's much better in the early days to learn a lot by selling directly to the customers, build up that knowledge and build up that leverage vis-a-vis different partners that you might have. And then once you've reached sort of developed enough stage, then you can go through partners. Great.
And I'm sharing with you the link of Agnologie, the perfumes we're talking about. Agathe is saying, thank you, very interesting. Francisco, no, it's not a question, sorry. Okay, on books and blogs, any recommendation on understanding B2C app economics, metrics to track and pricing?
Yes, I think the easiest way for that is if you send me an email. I have a couple things bookmarked.
Cool, but maybe we can send it actually to everyone.
Yeah, I can add it. I can add it in the slides. In the slides, I've put like the top 3 things that you should read, but I can add something a bit more extensive.
Cool. What else? Lucas from Barcelona still trying to convince you to join him with his amazing playground. So if you're there, go check his experience. All right. Francesco, we'll send you the links. We'll send you the list. I think by tomorrow we'll have this email. All right. Any thoughts of a business model for one B2C traction product suite, then transitioning to predominantly B2B model?
Again, very hard to answer the question from a theoretical sort of general point of view. What I do?
Healthcare app, B2B would be health insurer.
Okay. I mean, so it's not really transitioning in that case. So like typically, if you're doing, I don't know, an example would be there are a lot of cool companies that help women with tracking their period cycle. And so if you build a really good product and you have a lot of users, and then you think, and some users are even paying for a premium tier that allow the users to get, additional insights, whatever. And then you realize that this is also a great way for insurers to acquire new customers. And sure, you can sort of add these ancillary products, but the core of your business remains, getting that product into the hands of users. And I think it's so hard to do one thing well that you probably shouldn't be thinking about switching completely until you're well into the tens of millions of revenue.
All right, and the last one from Thomas, best mailing strategy for leads conversion.
Again, if I had, this is sort of like, I think that if I answer
magic question.
Yeah, like if I answer that question, I'm like the people who, make these YouTube videos saying, I figured out how to become rich doing this. I think there's no general strategy beyond having clear copy. So like people should understand what you're trying to sell. It's very funny. This is actually what I was planning on opening the next little talk with. So it's a good transition. But people often seem to think, that people seem to have the product in their mind. So they're trying to explain the product that they have when they're selling, rather than have the people who are looking to buy in their mind. And I think that's probably like the one thing that you should be doing is like, you're not trying to sell your product. You're trying to understand what the person you're writing to needs. And you should sort of reverse engineer your email from that. And like the best emails are emails that, address people in that way.
Great answer. We teach medical students how to be productive so they pass their first year. Online course, 300 euros for 18 years old people. So parents are paying for it. What's your advice to rich parents at scale?
I mean, I guess that in your case, the complicated thing is that you're not, it's quite hard to know who the parent of an 18-year-old medical student is. And so instead of reaching out to the parents, and so there's two things. One, it's quite hard to abstractly know if somebody's daughter or son is a medical student. And
you want to convince the kids directly.
Exactly. So you want to convince the kids directly. And the second thing is that medical school is usually competitive enough that almost regardless of parents' income situation, they'll try to find a way to find the money to help their children. So if you convince the kid, you've done a big part of the job to convince the parents. Usually if you're very driven and you want to go to med school, it's not your parents who are buying or like, telling you what to do, like you're doing it by yourself. So I just focus on building something that's incredible for the students. And if they think that there's a lot of value in it, I'm sure most of their parents will be paying.
All right. I think we can switch to the second part of the presentation.
Yeah.
2 minutes. And same, we'll be back with question. See you then, Matthias. Good luck.
Yeah. Cool. So now that we sort of talked about different ways in which you can launch, so the early days of having your product in the hands of users, we're going to go through a couple different acquisition channels and try to understand how you should be thinking about picking those channels. And so I think that one of the mistakes that founders make most often is that they think that they have to be doing everything at the same time. And obviously, if you could do everything perfectly at the same time, you probably should, but it's very rare. Like even doing one thing well, as I said, is quite difficult. And so the thing that you should be thinking about is how do I find the one thing that's a particularly good fit for my company, and how do I do that as quickly and as widely as possible. So to go to the origins of sort of acquisition channels, you have to go to the origins of how people can start using your product. And if you think about it, there's actually a very limited amount of ways in which people can start using your product. They can look for it directly thanks to word of mouth. So that's a form of virality, or because they saw an ad, that's performance marketing, or they can stumble upon it when they're looking for a solution to their problem, right? So that's usually SEO and content. So in those cases, there's already a high willingness to purchase, right? And so what we're going to be talking about now is the different ways in which you should think about whether or not it fits your model. So here I just put a table that I found in an article by Lenny Orchinsky from Airbnb on First Round. I've linked to it in the conclusion so that you can go and have a read at the long form. But essentially it gives you, per vertical, different acquisition channels that were used by some of the most iconic consumer companies of the past 20 years. And what you'll see is that often the acquisition channels are very linked to the kind of product that they were building. And that's the sort of way that you should be thinking about building your own go-to-market strategy and building your own acquisition channels. So if you take performance marketing, for instance, so Booking and Wish and TikTok, you'll see that, or Booking, Wish, TikTok is actually a bad example. Booking, Wish, Credit Karma, Blue Apron. You'll see that the reason performance marketing is a natural fit is that these companies tend to be companies that generate revenue directly from new users. So purchasing a product, subscribing to a service, etc. TikTok is a bit different because their model is still focused around advertising, though the end goal around TikTok is definitely to build some form of e-commerce play. And so I'm pretty sure that if I was doing this talk in 2025 instead of 2020, TikTok would already be a company where people transact directly on the platform. So performance marketing, general natural fit if you generate revenue directly from new users, or if customers aren't naturally going to be looking for your product. And so you have to come to them. So another example for that is, like, imagine you're building a sneakers company. And so you're a new sneaker brand. Because you're a new sneaker brand, nobody has heard about you because you're new. So by definition, people aren't really looking for you. I mean, some sneaker fans might be looking for you, but just because they're looking for new brands, not you specifically. And so if you're doing that, then maybe performance marketing makes sense. And then in that case, I don't know if you were all in the previous talk by my colleague Usama, but in that case, what you need to be looking at is my acquisition costs low enough that I can afford to essentially make margin when I'm selling my sneakers. The second category you see is virality. So you have companies that you'll all know here: Airbnb, Pinduoduo, Instagram, Zillow. And virality makes sense is a natural fit as an acquisition channel in two cases. So one is when you have these network effects. So it's like the product becomes better the more people join the network. So it can be either because there's more value if you join. If more hosts sign up, then the network has more value for guests, and if more guests sign up, the network has more value for hosts. So that's the case of Airbnb. But it can also be for you personally. If you're on Instagram and none of your friends are on Instagram, well, there isn't much value to it. Whereas if all of your friends are on Instagram, or if all of your friends are on WhatsApp, then obviously it becomes a very useful tool. And the second case for virality is if your products are innately fun to share. And this is something that a lot of people don't necessarily, or people tend to forget, is that one of the initial hacks of Instagram wasn't that it was a great network, it was that it was a great photo editing tool. And what Instagram did was that they made it super easy for people to share the pictures that they'd edited on Instagram onto new platforms. And then after a while, when everybody was editing their pictures thanks to Instagram, then they just started posting them to Instagram, and people completely forgot about, not completely forgot, but started using the other places less and less. But initially, people edit pictures on Instagram to upload them to Facebook. And what's funny now is that Instagram is the network, and a lot of people are spending money on tools to edit their Instagram pictures, because now Instagram attracts more value from being a great place for advertisers than it does from having people make great pictures. And so another example for virality would actually be, so there's two ways in which, it's not just fun to share. It can also be if it puts your customers in a good light to share, to share that they're your customers, right? So one way that it can put them in a good light is if it's like a select product. So like if you're a members club, and a members club can also be, a software members club. So typically Superhuman was invite only for a while, or Clubhouse as a sort of like audio social network was invite only for a while. You feel some prestige being a member, and so you talk about it because you want to brag, and other people hear about it. Or like in the beginning, same for Uber, you'd be trying to desperately find a cab, and then a friend would come and take his phone out, and 5 minutes later there'd be a car waiting in front of his house, and you'd obviously ask, like, how did you get a chauffeur to just come and pick you up? And they tell you about Uber, and everybody remembers that first ride. And then last, again, you see a lot of companies that you'll recognize, like Grubhub, or Expedia, or Pinterest, is content. And so there are different contexts in which content can be the best channel for acquisition. So one is if you have a lot of user-generated content. So typically, if you're a Thumbtack, so Thumbtack is a way to find small businesses in your area. So if you're looking for electricians or plumbers or hairdressers or beauty parlors or whatever, you can use Thumbtack. And so typically you'll be writing a lot of, there's a lot of reviews on Thumbtack. And so having all this user-generated content, it is a way to have a great SEO strategy. And that was actually how Thumbtack grew in the early days. We have several companies that did similar things, like Staff Service in France and several other markets. And the other case is if you have a lot of unique data that you can transform into content. So even if it's not generated directly by the user, so not reviews or posts or whatever, but you can extract a lot of data from user behavior. So typically if you're from user behavior or from your supply, like if your Booking.com is in the performance marketing category, but some of what Booking also did was create a good SEO strategy. And they could do that because they had a lot of listings for hotels in Paris, for instance. And so if you typed hotels in Paris, they could generate these custom pages for people to sort of reach out to. So that's the first thing, is you think about it in terms of, does it fit your model? And the second thing that you should obviously do is look at your data. So I'm not going to be able to give like the one benchmark that rules them all, because unfortunately there is no such benchmark. But here are a couple examples. So if you're doing performance or paid marketing, your tests in 99.9% of cases, your tests will generate paying customers with a healthy payback period. So what a healthy payback period means depends on the type of platform that you're building. So if it's like a high repeat platform, so you're building a platform where you expect people to come often, either because it's a subscription or because people just use your service quite a lot. So it can be a Spotify subscription, or it can be Uber because you're expecting to use to be driven around quite a bit. In that case, maybe your payback periods can be 3 to 6 months. And obviously, you want that payback period to be as short as possible, because the shorter it is, the more you can recycle the money. And what recycling the money means is, for every customer that you acquire, you wait until the end of the payback period, and then all the money that comes after that, you can use to acquire new users. And that way, you can grow super fast. If, on the other hand, you're a low volume transaction platform, because you're selling things that people don't buy often. So if you're if you're a good example would be a company in the UK called Fat Llama. One of the things that they started selling very early on was RVs, so recreation vehicles, like the big camper van sort of thing. If you wanted to, if you're building that kind of platform, people aren't going to be buying RVs all the time, and so you should get all your acquisition costs back at the transaction moment and some more. And so all the some more that you get, you can reinvest in growth. Virality, so understanding whether or not that channel is a good fit. Again, not like the benchmark, but a rule of thumb. If 50% of your new customer acquisition today is through word of mouth, that means that you have a good shot at virality being your acquisition channel. And that's especially true if you've already done a couple experiments that allow you to increase that behavior. And then last but not least, in content, one of the things that you should be looking at is whether in your space, there's a large amount of keywords that you score very well in, or if you haven't already built the content strategy that at least your competitors don't score very well in. So like if you realize, for instance, a good example of this was a colleague of ours called Maxime. He realized that there was no single platform that scored well for booking rooms, so like for private events in Paris. And so he built a SEO-focused platform for people who were looking to book rooms for, like restaurant rooms or whatever, or even shops to rent them out to private events. And because he realized that nobody was actually doing that, and that way he built up his business. So once you've found sort of what the model that you're going to allocate most resources to is, you really need to commit to it. And the reason that you need to commit to it, and there are several. First is that it actually takes some time. So I think the order is probably performance marketing. Performance marketing essentially is the quickest one to test. Like you can get results, I mean, not immediately, but within 1 or 2 weeks, just by spending money on Facebook, LinkedIn, Snapchat, TikTok, depending on where your audience is. Virality will probably take 1 to 2 months, and then content and SEO is probably the strategy that takes the longest. It takes maybe 3 or 4 months to actually get results. But once you decide that you found the channel that you're going to go for, you should stick to it for quite a long time. And sticking to it means several things. It means dedicating a significant amount of resources to that effort. And resources isn't just financial resources. It also means that when you're thinking about product, when you're thinking about design, when you're thinking about marketing, when you're thinking about engineering, a lot of the things should be geared towards that acquisition channel that you've identified as being your primary driver for growth. And so that means that when you're thinking about your product roadmap, but also when you're thinking about the customer experience, you should be optimizing for that lane being pursued, right? So, obviously, it doesn't mean that you'll be spending, if you're growing a viral product, you might be doing some paid acquisition tests on the side. But when you're thinking about the product, you should be thinking of it as a product that people join because other people told them to join, right? Or because they want to join the club. If you're a content-driven acquisition business, or if your acquisition is driven by content, and then you should assume that people came because they read one of your blog posts, or they searched for one of the terms, and you were the most highly ranked. You are the most highly ranked website, and that should really be the way that you think about for the business for quite a long time, actually. That being said, your main acquisition channel won't last forever, and there's a moment at which you hit an asymptote. And obviously, it's not always easy to predict exactly when that's going to happen. But fortunately enough, you sort of feel it when growth starts to plateau. And at that moment, usually what you need to do is to bring in another one of the acquisition channels. But if, usually you won't, usually you'll feel usually you'll feel that it slows down, and so you'll be testing. Fortunately, you'll start testing other things. But usually you'll feel that sufficiently late that you're already at sort of what we call escape velocity, and that you can afford to make new tests. And again, before we open back to questions, I think one of the things to really stress is that you should really be focusing on a single acquisition channel in the early days, and that as a CEO, so assuming that you're not the person who's building the product, but mostly working on product and acquisition, this should be your sole focus, and for quite some time, at least in the identifying and committing to it. And then obviously when you start scaling that, you'll hire a host, like a myriad of other people who will help you manage that acquisition channel. But in the early days, you should really just be focused on that. Cool. Time again for questions.
All right. Maybe you can put your slides off. And We can take your questions. So feel free to give us a little bit of context so we can give you some really on point answer. Feel free to pitch your startup, tell us what you've been trying, where you're struggling. We have 10 minutes.
We have launched an ed tech business. We're trying to get parents to enroll their kids for our tutoring. The issue, how do we reach them? Today, we found only Facebook, Google, and LinkedIn, which is super, super expensive. So, Anwar, funny you asked this. I started a tutoring business 6 years ago, and we had a very similar issue to you. So I can actually give a pretty precise answer to this question. So tutoring has one of the problems that was mentioned in the first session with Usama, which is that the end user is not the sort of person that's paying. And that comes with a variety of problems because you need to convince two people at once and you don't really know in which order you should do it. And so if you think about it, if you're selling to the students, so I'll give you sort of our analysis of the market at the time, and then I can tell you what we did. And my ultimate conclusion is that this is a very hard market. But essentially what the market usually does is that they convince parents that their kids need math tutoring. And that's one of the main reasons that tutoring is so expensive in places like London, is that it actually takes quite a lot of money to convince those people, because you need to do quite a lot of ads and you need to have quite a lot of support people. And most companies, especially in-person tutoring, only focus on the parents. And then what we did was that we thought that there was some value in tutoring for the kids, but that the value in tutoring for the kids was very different from the one that the parents would see. So the kids actually wanted help on like a specific bit of homework or a specific exam, and then they only wanted help on that thing. And when that was done, they wanted to move on. And so we, directed all our marketing to getting the kids to sign up. And then once the kid was signed up, we would give them a session for free, and then we'd request a credit card, and hopefully they'd ask their parents to do that. And acquiring the kid was a lot cheaper than acquiring the parent, because not that many people try to sell things to kids. And so I'd probably say that if a business is to be built in this space, it probably resembles that more than it resembles traditional tutoring marketing. So I'd probably go for the kids, and then try to make a product that's good enough that they want to spend some of their gaming money on it, which I admit is very hard.
Anais is asking, I feel like everybody wants their product to get viral, and we hear that word of mouth is super important. So how to choose between the 3 channels you talked about in your framework?
Yeah, so the 3 channels, mostly depend on the type of business that you're building. If you're typically if you're a sneaker company, it's any sort of fashion brand, or even most brands. I think it's okay to have a paid marketing driven business, right? So you pay for ads, you get clicks, and then your job is to make sure that the clicks are cheaper than what you're selling. And that's fine, right? Virality is important in places where you can't really afford to do paid marketing. And a lot of very great businesses aren't viral at all. Like obviously a lot of iconic businesses are, but I'd say focus on your business model, and based on that, you'll be able to pick your channel. And then for content, I think that's it.
All right. Lucas is asking, which tools do you recommend using to track your product metrics and KPIs? We're using Firebase, so naturally we're currently using Google Analytics, but should we use anything else at our early stage?
Yeah, so Lucas, I'd say that depends on the type of product that you're building. And the stage you're at. So if you're very early on, I don't think most of those metrics really matter as much as the
mobile consumer
data. So if you're a mobile consumer, I'd say that the best by far is Amplitude for tracking KPIs. But again, the thing is it would be, early on, it would probably be a bit overkill to look at everything. But I'd definitely say Amplitude is the best.
All right, I shall do the link. It's this one,
Our
right?
business relies not on needs, but rather on aesthetic impulse buy. Word of mouth is important to sell, but marketing performance competition went up during COVID, and content creation helps bonding. Hard to choose one. Yeah, I mean, hard to choose one. The thing is, like, a lot of founders think that if they do the 2 or the 3, like their output will be the cube, or sorry, the square or the cube. What usually happens is that you get the square root or the cubic root, and you know, by dividing your energy by 3, you get a lot less than a third of each. So I just say stick to one. Like, obviously, like, you know, people talking about your product is not virality. Virality is your growth being driven by your product. Like, if you do anything well, people will at some degree talk about it. Like, if you're taking about one of the things that are the most brandless, like toothpaste, if I buy a Signal toothpaste that's with charcoal, I might find it edgy and I might talk about it and say, like, oh, you know what, I have a charcoal toothpaste. But Signal wouldn't be saying, oh, he has, you know, we have virality driven marketing. It would just so happen that I told somebody about it. Same, you know, they might write blog posts about the fact that charcoal based toothpaste is super good for your teeth, but I'll never read a blog post about it, right? And if I came across one article, they probably still wouldn't say, oh, we're content driven, right? Like they have sort of 2 channels, but actually, which is one, it's paid marketing. It's just that one kind of paid marketing is the ads that they put online, and the other kind of paid marketing is being displayed in the right bit of the shop.
Thank you. We are indeed trying to answer kids' issues by giving them free sessions and above classes, which answer their problems. You are totally right. Thanks a lot. It is Anwar from School Up. Okay, any other questions, my friends? We still have 5 minutes if you want to. It's your moment if you want. All right, so no more questions. Matthias, you felt like you've gave your best and it's done. Now it's in their hands.
I mean, the hardest is yet to be done, but it was always in their hands.
All right, my friends. Salim, want some books?
Books advice about, honestly, I have never read a book about consumer go-to-market strategy. I think, I think the best advice for that kind of thing is definitely in blog posts. I'll link to a few of them. I think that anyone who tries to write a book about it, I mean, you know, one that might be interesting is Blitzscaling by Reid Hoffman. But even there, like, I think it's mostly anecdotal. Like, a lot of these things, as you see from the matrix I shared in the slides, like, a lot of these things end up being pretty unique. So one of the things that you can do is sort of like look at what a company did in an industry that's not yours and try and find the similarities both in the company's approach and in that industry's structure, and bring it back to yours. But, you know, the thing is, like, in this business, if people have found the recipe, they've built the company, right? So, like, there's no one who's going to give you the recipe. You sort of need to figure it out yourself.
I love webinars. Not because that's a strategy. We haven't been even talking about it, but, you know, as we are doing right now, I mean, our end goal at the family is basically to identify super interesting founders we could have a fit with, and that's one of the best way to start having a conversation. And there are tons of new kind of webinars platform.
Yeah, webinar is actually a great way for, I mean, I don't know for consumer products, but definitely for SMB focused products. I know we have a lot of companies in our portfolio, actually even for consumer products, like, but typically, you know, you do a webinar on how to manage your CRM, and then they talk about managing your CRM for 15 minutes, and then for 15 minutes they talk about their tool that does CRM cleaning or whatever. And I think that you can do similar strategies in consumer, but only if you're selling something that's expensive enough. Like one thing that I didn't mention, and maybe we can finish on that, and then people can go on the sort of speed networking thing. One thing that I didn't mention is that if you think about your business, you need to figure out if your business is marketing driven or sales driven. And so the rough, difference between the two is that when you're doing sales driven, when you're sales driven business, you have manpower that's dedicated to an individual transaction. So you're not selling to abstract people, you're selling to concrete people. And in consumer, it's quite rare that you can afford to do a sales-driven model, right? Like one of the rare things where you have sales-driven models in consumer is probably insurance, because the lifetime value is so long, because when you have an insurer, you stay with the same insurer for a very long time. It might be real estate, because if you buy a house, like the transaction value is so high that it could make up for somebody being dedicated to selling it to you. And then it might be very weird things that are surprisingly expensive. So like glasses are very expensive. So sometimes you have people who are dedicated to selling it to you, or dental hygiene stuff. Sometimes people dedicated to selling it to you. But other than that, when you're selling to consumers, it's very rare that it's sales driven. And so, marketing typically, marketing through webinars is typically one of the things that you can do at the beginning by giving custom attention to people. That doesn't necessarily scale. But then when you grow, you're sort of more doing it for abstract people, introducing your product.
Great. Okay, my friends. So now is the time to start networking. Now is the time to start meeting other founders. Now is the time to exchange upon your strategies and maybe give some of your tips to others.
Thanks, everyone.
It's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure to be with you, Matthias. It's a pleasure to be with you. We'll do other workshops. Thank you, Lucas, for your comments. It touches our hearts directly.
It really does.
and right now you're going to do the chat roulette. So basically you click on networking, okay, on your left. It's the bar on your left. Networking, or it depends, sometimes it can be in your own language. So réseautage if you're in French, for instance. Be nice, be cool, be interested by the other one. Pitch your project, listen to the project. And if you like this person, please click on connect, because right after you will have an email with the contact of this person. Okay, so don't forget to click on connect if you want to keep track, because there are not so many people actually who are able to dedicate 2 hours to learn about entrepreneurship. And you might find some interest in connecting for real and keeping the conversation open, and you start building your own network. Okay, so it's very important to create your own support system, and why not some of the members of your support system are actually here tonight ready to meet you. So simple rule, 5 minutes, and you will be able to meet as many people as you want until 8 p.m. So imagine how many people you can meet, okay? It's a lot of people you can meet. So enjoy this moment. It was a pleasure to be with you. Click on networking and start meeting other people.
Bye, everyone. Enjoy.
See you. I want to see all of the people watching, the number going down. Click on networking. Enjoy your moments and have fun. Let's go, let's go. I see you. I see we are still 20 people here. Let's go. Yeah, cool. Okay, now it's going down. And if you have questions, of course, before we leave. Thank you very much, Francisco, if you're still here. Thank you, Anwar. Allez, let's go. Come on. I still see 12 people. Don't be shy. Go network. It's a pleasure. Really, it's fun.
It might be the tab that's still open on the laptop.
Yeah, no. I know. Enjoy this moment. It's cool to connect with people you don't know. Really, especially during these times. That can be your clients. That can be your...
It's a shame we can't see the 11 people who are...
yes, we can see. You know what? You can click on the button if you want to talk with us. You click on the blue button and you can join us. If you want. If you want. All right. So maybe they have opened the tab with Usama and Balthazar. Okay, my friends. Now is the moment we say goodbye and we say we love you. It was a pleasure to be with you, and I hope you'll be enjoying networking. See you. Bye-bye.